Hello, folks. Welcome to another edition of the Causal Inference Book Club. I'm really glad to keep this going, and I'm glad folks are showing up. So, do me a favor, just post in the chat if you're here, what you're interested in, what you thought of the chapter, how you're liking things so far, and I will just jump into the slide deck in just a second here. It looks like we have about a couple people or so. So, let's see. Hello, Luke. Glad to hear from you. Glad to see you here as well. All right. While folks are getting settled in, I will go ahead and start this presentation. I don't know where folks are from, but hopefully it's either not too late or not too early for each of you. This week, we had the potential outcomes chapter. I thought this was a really cool chapter because it's the first time we were actually doing causal inference at all. We have been through a couple chapters now. The introductory chapter where we got an introduction to causal inference, probability and statistics, and regression review, which we learned the tool sets and the foundational methodologies that we'd be using throughout this course. And then we had the DAG chapter, and the DAG chapter was good. It explained why we need DAGs to do causal inference, why they're useful. We didn't actually do too much causal inference in this chapter, but this was the first one where we actually went and used a causal inference methodology and framework, which was really cool in my opinion. Like Luke, who posted here, he enjoyed reading the chapter and had to give it a few reads, but it's mostly gone in. You're going to see that's actually my same sentiment as well. Took me a couple reads. I actually had to read this chapter and another one, which I'll explain in a second. And I think I got it, but I'm going to admit that a little bit went over my head. So we'll start off with our same agenda. We'll talk about the community, because that's actually the most fun part for me about reading this book. I could have read this book myself, but it's been so much more enjoyable doing it in this format, sharing it with other folks, and having the discourse in this live stream and everything like that. We'll talk about the chapter, of course. Can't get around that. And then the next chapter. So anytime you have questions, drop them into the chat. There'll be a Q&A at the end. We'll just go over questions, but I'll also try and intersperse them in between as well. So community meetups. Thank you everyone for posting on the discourse. It's been really, really good. Folks have really been helping each other out. Like in the last chapter, there was a question about the policing DAG example, backdoor criterion, in Chad and a couple other folks went in and helped diagnose the issue. It actually ended up being a multi-collinearity issue. So really good that we had that. I want to thank Neil. Neil's been posting many resources, things that he's seen from other areas, and putting them into the discourse as well. So really, really appreciate it. I'm learning a lot there as well. And then we kicked off a thread for local meetups. So it seems like a couple of folks are going to get to see each other locally. Let me turn off my capture card. Seems like folks are going to find ways to sync up in person, which is absolutely fantastic. Again, the goal of this book club is to be asynchronous, fit everybody's schedules, get folks from across the globe together, which is why this virtual format works quite well. But can't deny that local meetups and meeting people face to face is quite amazing in its own right. So if you want, go to this discourse thread and find other folks that are in your area. All right, So let us jump into the chapter overview. Let me go full webcam here for a second. Like I said, I thought this chapter was quite great. First causal inference methodology that we've used end to end. We've seen there were actually 3 examples, if I remember correctly, about causal inference in this chapter. There was the one that led in about does welfare help people get out of welfare, it seemed like, or does it have a good outcome? Interesting that example was from the 1800s, I believe. So seems like the same questions come up century after century. So that was an interesting one. Also one about why the potential outcomes there could go wrong. But the HIV example that followed later, and then the secondary homeless example was quite good as well. And I found it really neat, actually, and very clever that Scott here connected sort of thematic examples. He used an example at the beginning from 200 years ago, and then used about social aid and welfare, and then he used a modern example at the end. So have to give him a hat tip for thinking of 2 examples that met in that particular way. Same with the HIV example as well. So I have to point out, I am, again, really enjoying Scott's care in writing this text and the way he's putting it together. As someone that's written a book, it's quite challenging to come up with cohesive examples that also explain the mathematical methodology well. He's done a fantastic job. All right. Turn off the webcam so you can see everything. So there were 3 things, again, that stuck out to me in this particular chapter. Potential outcomes, sources of bias. I actually think this is the sources of bias is the biggest topic of this chapter, because it's something that's so easy for folks that aren't studied up in causal inference to miss. And also it's something that me personally, I had some vague idea, but this chapter really solidified it for me in both math example and practice. And then we'll talk about randomization inference, which is, I thought a pretty neat method and a way of non-parametrically making inferences. So not Bayesian, not frequentious, but really just using the raw rules of probability to understand if an outcome was improbable or probable. Now, usually I post a figure that is most interesting within the chapter, but this week there weren't very many figures. The one that was in there, actually there was only one figure from my recollection, and the one in there, I didn't find it to be the most important topic of this particular chapter, but this table and all of these tables actually of the treated outcomes and the untreated outcomes were the really core of this chapter. So this section here, 4.1.3, is the one that we're going to cover the most. It had the meat of the important ideas and examples. So it's just, this is the table that did it for me in this entire chapter. So there were a lot of topics in this chapter, and I want to point out, and I'm going to more cover the ideas rather than the details and the nitty-gritty of each portion of it. So the examples was stable unit, treatment values, assumptions, or leverage, a deep dive into Fisher-Sharp null, for instance. These things are great and important. I'm going to leave them to the discourse to discuss, because since they're, let me go back to a webcam. Since they involve so much math and nuance and detail, I don't think me talking about it out loud here is going to be a better format than discussing it in text. So if you want to discuss these things, let's definitely do it on the discourse. It's great. We can bring up notebooks and use the LaTeX generator to render formulas and everything like that. The focus of this live stream is going to be more of the concepts that, again, I think are actually more important. I don't want to say more important than the math, but definitely the motivator for us to make smart causal inference decisions in life or in work, or when we think about causal inference experimentation or analyses, the underlying ideas behind them. On that topic, by the way, let me know what you think. I don't know whether folks want a math tilt in this live stream or they want a conceptual tilt in this live stream. always trying to balance both. So this ends up being the most useful for all of you. So we're going to go over potential outcomes. Really can't avoid this topic. Again, the primary idea in this chapter, the one-line summary that I could come up with is, if we did something, what would the effect be? If we didn't do something, what would the effect be? And really, what was the difference between both? The idea, the name potential outcomes being that you really can only observe one of these outcomes. You potentially could get one outcome, or you potentially could get the other outcome. And the idea is, how can we make causal claims when we only get to see one of these at a time? Now, there's a very interesting trick in this chapter, which I really appreciated, was in this example that we're bringing up again here, 4.1.3. We made the assumption that we could see both outcomes. Scott wrote this in a way that we hypothetically could see both the chemotherapy outcome and the surgery outcome, and we could have a full table. This was actually really nice because now we could derive a full set of insights and equations and do math and really see what would happen. Now, in real life, of course, we would not be able to give somebody both. We would not be able to see both the surgery outcome and the chemotherapy outcome independently. But this example did a great job explaining how to think about these things in a very applied setting. Something, again, that I appreciate about this book. It could have done this all theoretically, but it chose to lead with a motivating example to help solidify these in our head. Okay, so I think most folks would understand this intuitively. This is something that I hear a lot when I'm talking to, let's turn myself back on, to analysts of all levels, data scientists, even if they're not causally inference trained. It seems just natural that if you've made it to any data career, the idea that you can just treat one group and see what happens and not treat another group and see what happens is the quote-unquote magic formula for understanding what the difference in effects is. So, the classic example is you treat somebody with a drug like chemotherapy or surgery. You don't treat somebody with a drug or chemotherapy, and you take the difference and you see what happens. It's marketing, right? You send a bunch of people an email, you see how much they spend. You don't send a bunch of people an email, you see how much they spend. And lo and behold, now we know what our marketing lift is. And typically people go, oh, well, we can just take these differences because we randomized in some sort of way. Absolutely true. We saw that in that chapter, and I don't think this will be a surprise to anybody on this book club. But I think what was most interesting is this next slide. Actually, one second before we get to the next slide. I wanted to say thank you for the terminology note. Scott calls this a simple difference of means in the text, but then labels it simple difference of outcomes in the formula. That threw me for a little bit of a loop, so thank you, BKK Timner, for clearing that up for me. But with that terminology being cleared, the sources of bias is what's most interesting to me, because I think a lot of people get this. It's fairly intuitive, but we sort of just say, hey, let's randomize, and suddenly we can make this inference. True, but Scott spent a lot of time explaining what happens if you can't randomize, or what happens if the selection is made based off of human judgment, which he, again, provided a very motivating example for. A doctor is very rarely is not going to randomly assign chemotherapy or surgery treatments, right? A doctor's whole entire job is to help the patient have the best outcome possible. So we're not randomizing here. And if we don't randomize the treatment, which is this D indicator here, right? If we're not making these totally random, there ends up being two more sources of bias, which interfere with us understanding the average treatment effect. And that makes it different than the simple difference in outcome. So no longer does the simple difference in outcome and average treatment effect equal each other just plainly. You have to account for these two things here as well. I really think people miss this. Honestly, I think I didn't fully grasp this for years, and seeing it laid out in this chapter made it, like Luke said, it took a couple read-throughs to understand what was going on. But now it's really firmly stuck in my head, and I think I'm much better for it. So let me explain. Let me go into the next slide. In that, I have to admit that it was tough to read it in the Causal Inference Mixtape. I found the words selection bias and heterogeneous treatment effect bias, they didn't quite click with me entirely, but there were two things that helped. Let me go through before I talk about this extra resource. One was actually going in and calculating it out. So I thought I had this loaded, but let's pull it up. 1 second, folks. One was going through and actually calculating it out by hand. Now, the numbers that are the magnitude of each term is presented in the book. Scott shows us the numbers and he shows us the calculation, but really just going in and loading in the data and proving it for myself, even though it's just algebra, it's literally just adding, it helped me to really reinforce these concepts in my head. So if you're still confused about these, and if you're anything like me, I have a tough time learning just from conceptual formula and then having those conceptual formulas stick in my head. Even if I can read the formula and it's very clear to me, as honestly, addition is very clear to me these days, but getting these ideas to stick in my head, I find when I go in and write it down in code and type it through, that reinforces it for me enough. So I've done it here. You're welcome to take this notebook and do it yourself, but really that's one of the resources that did it for me. That's one of the ways. But the other one, as you can see here, is this book. This one here. So I have Morgan and Winship, and I've been reading this book alongside Causal Inference. Along Causal Inference Mixtape. And the important thing is, let me go back one slide. The reason this helps is they actually rename the terms, and it was just that simple renaming that really did it for me. So instead of calling it selection bias, they call it baseline bias. So they renamed this and this, and then instead of calling it heterogeneous treatment effect bias, they renamed it differential treatment effect bias. Just these renamings helped me out quite a bit as well. And their example in Morgan and Winship helped click. So for baseline bias, the example they used is if somebody goes to college, does that help them become more educated? And what is it? And especially, what is the magnitude of that education? So this makes it more interesting. It's a very common thing. Is going to college worth it? And how much more worth it is it to go to college? Now you have a group of people. You have people that self-selected to go to college, and then you have people that self-selected not to go to college. The important bit here is that the self-selection means it wasn't randomized. We didn't randomly take 100 high school students and put 50 in college and 50 and ban them from college entirely to see what would happen. That would be a crazy experiment. I don't think that is quite possible, at least in most modern democratic countries like India or the United States or most parts of Europe. So given that we only have a data set of people that have self-selected to go to college, where do these two sources of bias pop up? Well, the first, which is called baseline bias, but here called selection bias in the book, is that people that go to college very likely already are more educated to begin with. So even if they went to high school, and this is anecdata, but people that went to my high school that ended up going to college were more educated in the same high school than folks that were not going to college in that same high school. Nothing wrong with personal life choices, but just as we're studying the effects of education, That's the baseline bias. The group that self-selected to go to college were treated with college, already had more education than folks that did not go to college, even prior to treatment. The second bias was a little bit more subtle, and the calculation made it a little bit trickier, but I will do my best to explain it on this live stream, but at least keep the intuition in your head. It's that people that self-selected to go to college will experience a greater magnitude and effect from college because they're already better at learning. So if we took two people, one that wasn't going to go to college, let's say somehow, and one that was going to go to college self-selected, the self-selected person, maybe they were already primed. Maybe they were more motivated, let's say, or let's say they already knew a lot of ways to learn from college that they learned in high school. So once they were treated with college, they saw a greater magnitude of effect than somebody who wasn't going to go to college, but let's say was coerced to go to college for whatever reason. So it's the magnitude of effect that is greater. And as we are trying to estimate the magnitude of the effect of college education, we have to correct for that non-parallel path. I've seen this being called the parallel paths assumption, or in this case, it's not. We're not making that assumption that if both units are treated, they'll experience the same effect. If we bring this to the surgery versus chemotherapy example, it's that somebody who needs chemotherapy would equivalently. Well, I'm gonna word this poorly. Let's see if I can get this right. It's if somebody that got surgery, if they instead got chemotherapy, would they have the same response to chemotherapy as somebody who actually got chemotherapy? It's a little bit tricky. Let me know in the questions if I explain that correctly or not, but this is the one term that threw me for a loop a little bit, but these rewordings and this example in this particular textbook is what made it click for me. So I've already shown you the notebook to replicate it for yourself. If you'd like to, it's the code is there, but I also encourage you not to use my notebook and to do it for yourself. I'm going to pause here for 10 seconds. That was the largest section of the chapter, really the most important part of this particular chapter. It takes about 10 seconds for this live stream to catch up to you. So I will pause here, again, a little bit awkwardly, waiting to see if anybody has any questions before we move on, or comments. Love comments as well. All right, going once, going twice. Oh, I see one here from Julio, actually. I'm interested in a lot of areas, including finance and behavioral economics. Enjoying the book club, had to read the chapter a few times, along with other materials. As you can tell, Julio, you are in great company. It sounds like Luke had to do that as well. I definitely needed to do that by getting a couple of other books like this book and some online Googling to reinforce my learnings. But I find that the Causal Inference mixtape is a really good framework, especially, and it has motivating examples that then motivate me to go to other places to learn. So our primary textbook here, this Causal Inference mixtape, is doing its job quite well. Luke says, I struggle with heterogeneous treatment effects as well. So the same way of saying the treatment is non-symmetric on the individual. I think your understanding is correct if I understand the words, that the treatment effect would be different or non-symmetric depending on for each group and the individuals in those groups. But I think the important part is it's the group as a whole. So this is the tough part, not the individuals within a group, because maybe some individuals will have the same effective treatment as, I gotta turn my slide back on. Maybe some individuals will have the same treatment magnitude of effect in the treated group as those in the untreated group, but it's more of the group as a whole. I think this is another thing we have to remember about this particular derivation, is this derivation isn't about individuals, it's about the entire group. It's the average treated effect on the treated group and the average treatment effect on the untreated group. I have to, the words are really long, I had to write them down, so don't they were very long definitions, a lot of words in those definitions, but more importantly, it's about the average of these groups, not about the individuals in the groups. Now, of course, you need the individual, Of course, we need to know the individual outcomes to calculate this, but you have to look at the average of the entire group. That was another thing that really threw me, is that it's about the group when we do it in that analysis. It's not about the individual outcomes. It also notationally got me as well, to be honest. I have to really squint to be like, these are individual outcomes and these are group outcomes. So should have mentioned that. Don't trip up on the mathematical notation here. You really have to like ensure when you're doing the calcs whether it's the individual or whether it's the group. Luke says that makes sense. Glad that helped. Alexandros, nice to see some causal inference vibes. As a PhD in epidemiology, I'm seeing DAGs everywhere. However, while they look interesting for me, just a hypothetical world a researcher builds, and I can have a different opinion. Yeah, I actually found that to be something refreshing to be in this chapter. In the last chapter as well about DAGs is Scott plainly stating that, these are worlds that researchers put up and they have to be just as justified as every other part of the analysis. So really good to get these I'd say very personable and very like down to earth examples, not obscured by tons of math, not beating you to death with sort of, I want to say, an ivory tower definition of economics and causal inference, but a very like, I don't know, it feels like more like a casual coffee chat sort of. He writes it as a mixtape, so it feels like, a mixtape is a very personal thing that you give to somebody, and I think he did a really good job writing it in that style as well. All right. Thank you for all those questions. Thank you for engaging. It makes it so much better for everybody. So there was another topic in this chapter. There were a couple other topics, but the other topic that we'll talk about here is randomization inference. So the leading example he brought up in here was Fisher and the woman he was working with. And this woman had stated that she could tell the difference between whether tea was poured first into a cup or whether milk was poured first into a cup. And so Fisher had this really great idea. And we're going to do a randomization inference example right now. In the next slide, I want to test whether you folks are psychic or not. And so I want you to tell me which one of these 8 cups are going to turn into a different colored cup. There's 4 of them. And so if you are psychic, or if you look at the slide deck ahead of time, or ignore those people, if you haven't seen the slide deck ahead of time, we're going to test if you're psychic by magically turning 4 of these cups into a different colored cup. So, all right, ready? Here's the countdown. 3, 2, 1, and there we go. So if you were psychic, and assuming you didn't cheat by looking at the slide deck ahead of time, there is only a 1 in 70 chance you would have known that this cup, this cup, this cup, and this cup would have turned into these pink mugs. And that's how we would be able to tell and make an inference that you are psychic, because it is such a low chance that you could have randomly picked out that these 4 were the ones that were going to turn over into pink mugs, that can't argue with 69 out of 70 chance that the converse. which is you really only would have got it 1 in 70 times. That's my ham-handed explanation of randomization inference. So Fisher's idea here was that we treated these teas in different ways, whether we put the milk first in or the tea in first. And since this woman was able to figure out which ones were poured first without any other information, she must have been able to really actually tell whether tea was poured in first or milk was poured in first. This is actually a really cool idea, I have to say, because we spend a lot of time talking about these parametric frameworks, like t-tests in the frequentist side, or chi-square tests, or all these things that make distributional assumptions with parameters. And then even for me on the Bayesian side, there's a lot of parametric Bayesian work for we assume this is a normal likelihood, or we assume this is a beta prior, or binomial likelihood, or whatever the case might be, and then we're trying to infer parameters. Good reminder that you can do inference without needing all those distribution or all those parameters. You can just use the rules of probability to go ahead and do that. And I found this example to be a really good one for that. Now though, this was not a potential outcomes framework example. This was just an inference example. The T example then motivated this example about how we can use randomization inference with potential outcomes. And I'm going to very explicitly say that my knowledge about this is I have a pretty weak understanding, so take everything I say next on the next couple slides with a grain of salt. I'm still trying to work through the machinery in my head and make sure I fully understand it. But what I understand is that you do a couple, let's say, sleight of hands to get to potential outcomes framework. What we do is we calculate the simple difference of means with these two groups. And now these are the actually observed outcomes. We can't see the counterfactuals in this case. So unlike the chemotherapy example, turn my webcam back on. Unlike the chemotherapy example where we magically pretended we could see both the outcome with surgery and chemotherapy, this example is much more, is like the real world, in which we can't see both outcomes. We can only see the outcomes for the untreated group and the treated group here. But we still need to make some sort of inference of whether the treatment has an effect or not. So what we do is we take the simple difference of means and we get a value and we calculate it in the book. But that value could just occur by chance. There's nothing saying that actually is the particular value. So what we do is we assume, let's see if I put the slide in here. I did not. Okay. What we do is we assume that the treatment did nothing. So each of these gets the same value. And then what we do is then we randomly assign treatments. We randomly mutate this treatment vector, and we essentially randomly generate every other possible combination of it. And then we recalculate the simple difference of means again for the hypothetical treatment. And we do this thousands of times. Now, because there's eight here, which matches the 8 here, we do this 1,679 ways because we've observed one of the ways. So we need to randomize all the other ways. We calculate the difference of means, and then we create a test statistic to see whether the difference we saw here, whether it be the mean or the median or whatever test statistic we choose, is greater, the number of times it's greater than all other 1,679 random combinations. And if this ends up being greater many more times, then we can conclude that there is, we can conclude with a great, with great confidence, our credibility. I want to avoid using confidence interval here because that's not what we're doing. But let's say with great gumption that that the treatment has an effect. I will fully admit that was probably not the best explanation. So if someone has a better one, let's post it in the discourse. This is certainly something that I need to solidify in my head more. So I also would be going through this section of the chapter more to really understand Fisher-Sharp null and the test. But at a high level, the ideas make sense to me. I just would have trouble proving this, let's say, in a PhD defense and feeling confident that I've proved this in a PhD defense. I'm confident it's true because Scott has presented it and there are a number of other resources, but I'm not confident internally entirely. So need to build up that confidence myself. Now, I always like to leave, I think Scott leaves a lot of, actually, I know Scott leaves a lot of really interesting ideas and tidbits in the written word. So I thought he did a really good job here in really tying the potential outcomes framework, not as a mathematical idea, but as a human idea. And to say that to ask questions like these is, let me turn the webcam off. To ask questions like these is to engage in storytelling. Humans have always been interested in storytelling, and he brings up a number of pop culture stories here. These are fun hypotheticals to entertain, but they're still storytelling. So I think he did, again, a really good job tying it to the human aspect and explaining why we care about these things. And in me coming from industry, these are the stories that people want to tell, right? These are like, my boss wants to know whether the effect of marketing does something, and they want to usually hear it in some sort of story about it. Whether even if it has an effect, they usually want to find a story, right? They want to find some customer where they had some great experience and they saw the marketing and they were really convinced. I've recently seen a lot of Mint Mobile commercials, for instance, on YouTube, and Ryan Reynolds, the whole thing is him telling a story about the outcome of signing up for Mint Mobile. So yeah, just a fascinating, again, I think Scott does a fascinating job blending the math and all of this, like, all of these, probability and stuff like that, but bringing it back to people. All right. So what is next? Oh, we have a question, actually. Why 1,680 combinations? Shouldn't it be 70 times instead? I probably misquoted. I will just bring the combinatoric max to the discourse, but I think there is 1,680 ways to assign to choose the cups, but there's 70 permutations. Okay, so I think this one is, I always forget, but combination where the order matters. So 1,680 ways to orderly choose the cups, but 70 combinations, if I got that right. So order versus not order. Always get combinations and permutations mixed up in my head. I'm sorry, Rahul, for confusing you there as well. The question was, why is it 1,680 versus 70? And the answer is combinations and permutations and ordering, if ordering matters or if ordering doesn't matter. All right. So what's next? I forgot to update the image here. It is not the potential outcomes causal model, but it is matching and subclassification. So I briefly looked through the chapter a little bit. It's going to be on, does smoking cause lung cancer? That was the motivating example there. Probably one of the most famous examples of causal inference, and probably the biggest societal probably one of the biggest societal shifts, I have to say, from something like this. I think people used to smoke a lot more than they do now, and smoking used to be a lot more accepted than it was now. So really interested to see the math and its application to matching and subclassification framework. I'm going to give this again another 2 weeks. It feels like 2 weeks is a good cadence. Do let me know in the chat right here and on Discourse whether this 2 week cadence is working out for you. But if I think it is, it'll help us get through the book at a reasonable pace and not drag this book club on too long. But again, let me know. Happy to adjust, make it 3 weeks. 1 week probably will be too short even for me, but let's see. Let's see what you folks think. With that, that's everything I had for prepared material. I'm going to leave it completely open to questions here. I know, again, a live Q&A for me. or for others on the chat. So let's have at it. What questions do you have? What comments do you have even? What do you think about this chapter? What did you like? What did you not like? Do you feel like you're better for having read this and understanding the potential outcomes framework? You're still confused about combinations and permutations like I am? Let me know. Let's see. I can see Rahul and Blake are talking about combinations and permutations. Yep, 70 ways to choose for these, but 1,680 combinations of those cups. Thank you, Blake, for clearing that up for me. Frankly, I have to always go to Python when I do these things, and I just end up using itertools, combinations, and permutations to just double check my understanding with a trivial example of a 4x4, just to make sure that I get it right each time I need to do something like this. Luke says, I'm happy with the cadence, plenty of time in between to get most of the reading in. Okay, perfect. I'm glad you're able to read the chapter. I was actually really also interested to hear whether people are actually reading the chapters or whether they're just coming to these live streams. But it seems like people are reading the chapters as well, which is great. Anything else? I'll give it another awkward 10 seconds here while the live stream catches up to you. Blake says, definitely useful to learn. Will help looking through research papers to see if the study is actually valid. Blake, I'm curious which study you're looking at, and whether the lung cancer study, or let me know which study. I'll be honest with you, I'm actually not reading the research papers very thoroughly. I'm really interested to see how this can be used in practice. And for me, actually, I shouldn't say in practice because research is practice and I shouldn't word it like that. But I'm really interested to see how this works in, let's say, the freer world of industry, because that's where I work. So people like actually Sean Taylor, who I have to give Sean Taylor a lot of credit. Let me see if I can pull up his tweet right now. I want to show you folks this. He did me a real good solid. If you folks don't know Sean Taylor, he does economics by training. He had a PhD in it, but he helped me out a whole bunch. I had this question about whether we can make stable unit treatment value assumptions in practice, and he worked at Lyft and Facebook, especially, big companies where they do. Oh, I'm not showing my screen. Sean here, he's worked at big companies applying this stuff in practice, and he helped give me this answer. Depends on the treatment and experimental design, and him and I are gonna go chat with it more. So I will be happy to share what I learned from Sean when I get a chance to chat with him in a future live stream. But for me, I'm very interested in seeing what happens when you do these things in industry. And I happen to work at organizations that do very big things, so it's hard to make assumptions that the big thing that we've done, whether launching rockets or whatever, doesn't have an effect on the industry as a whole. So for me, that's more fascinating than the studies. Blake says, just in general, if I come across a study claiming some effect, I have to admit though, this is really important. With COVID and everything, right? It is always the canonical example that we love using in statistics these days because it affected everybody. Really interested to see, are vaccines, causal or they're not? Were the people who got vaccines, this is a great example, right? Where the people who got vaccines, were they predisposed to get less COVID anyway because they take precautionary measures versus people, let's say, that opted not to get the vaccine because is their behavior happen to also correlate with riskier behaviors? Who knows? Actually, the HIV example in the book was another really good example of that, right? Talking about the effects of treatment and for people that engage in behaviors and what their risk tolerance ended up being. So I would certainly go and read that HIV example if you have not done so already in the book. All right. Rahul says, why not use simple regression instead of calculating the simple difference of outcomes? Linear regression also controls for different variables, provides subjects were assigned treatment at random. I think this is actually a really good move by Scott. I think people jump to regression initially, and regression introduces a lot of different assumptions and how do I word this? I think a lot of people assume when they use regression, they know what's going on, and they just sort of understand the results. But as evidence in the last chapter about DAGs, is that if you don't think about your regressions in particular ways, you'll be making completely false statements or completely misunderstand the situation. So in this chapter, actually, you're right. I think Scott could have done that, but I think he really importantly didn't do that when he was bringing up simple difference in outcomes, to just focus on the potential outcomes framework independent of the estimation methodology and controls and everything like that, to really explain what was going on. He does then talk about the independence assumption in depth. I think in section, actually just want to pull it up because he talks about it quite well in section 4.1.4, I believe. Let's just bring it up so you can see it. Let me put my window up again. He brings it up here. So Rahul, I would suggest reading this section here. But in the HIV example, they do use regression, and they do talk about. He does talk about how this particular author uses ordinary least squares coefficients to make estimations, and how that works out in the potential outcomes framework. So I would do a poor job of rehashing it here. I would suggest reading these two sections of the chapter to get an understanding of what's going on, and then I think I'd skim through the next chapter, we're going to talk about this matching and subclassification and regression in the next chapter as well, I believe. So, excellent question, Rahul. Anything else? Any other questions? If not, I will end this live stream in about, again, 10 seconds to see if anything comes in. Rahul says thanks. Certainly appreciate it. All right. I'll do a count. Well, one of the potential outcomes is we're going to end this live stream in about 10 seconds if no one, treats this live stream with an additional question or comment. So giving it a 5 and a 4 and a 3 and a 2 and a 1. Okay. Looks like we're about done with today's Sunday live stream of the potential outcomes chapter. Again, really excited that you folks are taking part of this. I'm glad that we've got a core group here that comes and engages in the live stream, and this format is working for you. Always love your feedback, so post in the discourse, message me directly. Let's make this work for you if it isn't already. Hope you enjoy your Sundays. Thank you again, and I will see you next time.